Jonathan Aitken was a well-connected old Etonian, an MP and a high-flying cabinet minister. But one day in June 1999, he went from being served morning coffee by his butler to the loneliness of a cell in the notorious Block 3 of Belmarsh Prison. David Hallam, a local preacher at City Road Methodist Church, asked Jonathan Aitken how he coped with the sudden loss of freedom and isolation from family and friends, something that many of us have experienced in recent months, though for very different reasons.
Well, I had some pretty good compulsory practice at isolation. I was banged up, as we say in prison, for at least 18 hours a day and 23 hours a day at weekends in a tiny little cell. I got a single cell, but still I was very much isolated, and there were no mod cons like television sets. You had to cope with your own isolation. And some of the guys go stir crazy in those kind of conditions. I didn't go stir crazy, or at least not for more than a day or two, because I worked out a kind of survival kit for isolation. And my survival kit was to make a routine, a sort of rigorous timetable, sort of 9 till 10, read Matthew's Gospel, sort of 10 to 11, enjoy a novel of P.G. Wodehouse or something, but actually to have a schedule, or I had a lot of letters. So, and I think anyone who really wants to enjoy isolation will do it better if they impose quite strong discipline on themselves. In my own case, I did impose some spiritual discipline, because I was interested in doing some Bible reading, still a pretty good novice, obviously doing some praying. I also had been offered a place by Oxford University to read theology, provided I passed an exam in New Testament Greek, subject which I had never done in school from sheer laziness. So I tried very hard to master New Testament Greek in my single cell with nothing to help me except one textbook. And I worried like anything how you pronounce various words, which was quite unnecessary because nobody knows how to pronounce New Testament Greek. But and I used to go out onto the wings every day with a little postcard of new Greek words. And I remember one old lag saying, "Oh, Johnny, come on, we don't believe it. Those squiggles, they're not Greeks, we know. They're the codes for your secret Swiss bank accounts," which were rather in the news at the time, or less in the news.
Can I ask
anyway,
you?
I got through it.
But then that was how you dealt with it. But suddenly you had your family withdrawn from you. You had all the people you loved withdrawn. I mean, you did have some visitors, some high-profile visitors like Lord Longford. I read in your autobiography. Yes. But I can imagine on a Saturday evening, about 11 o'clock, it must have been very lonely for you. And you must have felt very isolated, much as a lot of our church members do at the moment. They feel quite isolated. What would your advice be to people who feel isolated?
Well, of course, we live in a noisy, gregarious, over-bombarded with activities age. And it's something very new to suddenly have to cope with silence and isolation and loneliness. And nobody is much good at it at first, but you do adjust. And there's no point in arguing with it. Certainly, if you're a prisoner, you're not going to argue with. And even if you're crazy, if you're in isolation, start to rail against the government, whoever it is, for creating the conditions where we have to isolate. The great thing is that I'm going to go in the flow. How can I make the most of this? What can I do that is new? And it may be doing much more reading. It may be some spiritual self-examination, searching. It may be writing more letters. And I didn't have anything like a computer or an iPhone. You just had to sit down and write letters by hand. But I think the human spirit should be adjustable. It should be capable. And the worst thing is to start becoming either angry or frustrated or full of self-pity. Those are the great mistakes. The good thing to do is to say, well, I'm here, I'm isolated, no one could have foreseen this crisis, I've got to get on with it.
Right. yeah, when I first met you, I just want to pick up this issue. You're here, you're wearing a dog collar. You're now a reverend. When I first met you at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington all those years ago, you were in all the papers, and you were being portrayed as a rogue. You were subsequently described in court as being a serial liar. You spent 18. You were sentenced to 18 months in prison for perjury, and you served 7 of those months. And now you're a dog collar. Can you briefly tell me? There's quite a journey. Can you tell me what the main stops were on the way?
Well, at the point when we met, I was through a very painful process, which I could summarize as defeat, disgrace, divorce, bankruptcy, and jail. And every step of that was painful. I think I'd have been pretty insensitive, maybe as insensitive as the newspapers were portraying me at that time, and pretty arrogant if I'd said, well, I don't think I need to change, do I? Instead, I said the absolute opposite. I know I need to change. I know I've got to find new navigation points, and I realized that I've completely screwed up. How should I go about this? And one of the ways I went about it was to start spiritually searching, which turned out to be wonderfully rewarding. I mean, it was rather amazing if coming out of prison that my next sentence, if you like, was 2 years at an Anglican theological college in Oxford, where the food was rather worse than prison. But I just wanted to go on, but I had not the slightest intention of becoming ordained. I think if I had, I'd have given dog collars a bad name at that particular point in my notoriety. So this was never my intention. I think what became my intention was I'd like to try and do in this new life some sort of service to the God I am really falling in love with and wanting to serve, wanting to help. But I rather thought that I would sort of perhaps take the profumo route of doing some very low-level, menial kind of job in a church or in a monastery. I even thought of for a time. And things just worked out differently. Why did they work out differently? Owing to nothing to do with me really at all. It was to do with the abundant and transforming grace of God. And when I think of why am I ordained, well, the story there in a few sentences was that I left Wycliffe Hall, where the whole place was full of budding vicars-to-be, and they often said to me, well, why didn't you join the club? You know, you're passing the exams, you're going to the same services with us, and you're going to the same missions with us. Why didn't you join the club? And I honestly, first of all, did not feel worthy of it, but secondly, I see that all of them, they had a tremendous calling, and I didn't have that calling. I wanted to serve, but not to the extent that they wanted to serve. So what happened? Well, it was a God instance, you might say. About 3 years ago, there was a crisis in our prisons, all to do with understaffing, misguided cuts by George Osborne. A lot of the prisons were suddenly so short of staff, they were on the verge of rioting. Some did riot. And in the middle of August, I was suddenly asked to write an article for the Sunday Times about the crisis in our prison service, completely secular article. I wrote it, I made some suggestions about things we should do. And the next thing I knew was that suddenly people started emailing me saying, have you seen Archbishop Justin's tweet about your article? Well, in those days, I hardly knew what tweeting was. My IT skills are not that wonderful now. And why I didn't even know he tweeted. It took about 2 days to find this tweet. It was a very nice tweet saying it's a very good article, everyone should read it. And then he added the words, Jonathan Aitken is a good and godly man who can make a great contribution. So it's words to that effect. And at that time, I was sort of being woken up in the night by mysterious murmurs saying, I want you to be ordained. And I really, in effect, said, please shut up, God. This is ridiculous. I am 74 years old, far too old anyway. I don't think anyone would want me. But these some nagging thoughts kept occurring. And then the murmurs seemed to say, well, I want you to be a prison chaplain. That's what I meant. Well, that sort of made a bit more sense, because we're all sinners in a prison, and an ex-con being a chaplain, I assure you, is rather a useful thing to be. And so I thought about it, and I thought, no, I won't do anything about it. And then I fell back on the slogan of the Pharisees, if I remember rightly, give us a sign, I said. And suddenly there's this email from just the head of my church saying, Jonathan Aitken is a good and godly man. And I thought, well, maybe I should take this a bit more seriously. And I then wrote off to my local bishop, who I knew as it happened because he'd been my tutor at Wycliffe Hall, and said, I think I might be being called to being a prison chaplain. What do you think? And he said, well, fill in some forms called BAPS, for some reason, Bishop's Advisory Panel. And then I went on a sort of journey of discernment. It was called being interviewed by some rather intrusive, difficult questioners. And they said, well, come and be ordained. We'd like you to be ordained. So I was.
Can I just go back a little bit? There was
Yes.
a moment when you knew you were in trouble. You knew that you were being harassed by the press. Your marriage was in trouble. There were financial issues coming up. And there was a moment when you decided, I believe it was to go to an Alpha course. There was something that made you move. Can you just describe what happened at that moment?
Well, when I was in this deep trouble, and very well publicized trouble, a man who I used to think of as the most boring man in the House of Commons, but he was a staunch Christian. His name was Michael Allison. He had been Holy Trinity Brompton's church warden in the days when services still consist of having sherry with the vicar after matins. But he came to me and said, I'd like to come and pray with you, and I'd like to bring one or two friends. And these guys started to say to me, you ought to do an Alpha course, you know. And I said, what's that? And when I heard about it, I cannot tell you how determined I was not to do an Alpha course. Happy clappies, twanging electric guitars, people sitting around in groups sharing their sins. I said, no, absolutely not for me. But these guys are very polite and very persistent. You don't have to just go once, you know, just sample it. It works for a lot of people. So along I went to Holy Trinity Brompton, feeling very uncomfortable. And at the end of the first session, the first thing I started feeling was one of tremendous relief. So it's not nearly as bad as I thought it was going to be. Actually, this talk was rather good. The jokes were rather good. But I said to myself, well, it's not really quite me. I don't think I'll come back next Thursday if I've got another better invitation. Problem was, it was a time in my life when I wasn't getting any invitations. So back I went the next day, the next Thursday, and the next Thursday after that. And then about the fourth Thursday, the talk was, how do we pray? And a very attractive young woman in a miniskirt, I think then her miniskirt was more interesting to her than her sermon, her talk, but she was very, very good, very impressive talk. And she said in a rather sort of girl guide-ish leader way at the end, right now, those of you who want to restructure your prayer life, remember the acronym ACTS: adoration, confession, thanksgiving, supplication. And I got home that night, and it was a rather lonely time. My wife had left me, my children were scattered in various universities and places. I was all alone. And I said, well, what did that very good young woman speaker with the miniskirt say? What was it? Acts, adoration, what? And I gave it a try. And it didn't just happen like that. But nevertheless, I started to pray more seriously in a structured way. And then gradually things started to happen. I certainly went back to all the other sections of the Alpha course. I went to the Holy Spirit weekend with great trepidation, not really believing that a Holy Spirit movement was possible, at least in my direction. Not a bit of it. I had the most enormous Holy Spirit experience. And so my Alpha course experiences, starting with being extremely reluctant, ended up being extremely grateful to God and to the Alpha course. And I teach bits of the Alpha course from time to time now with great enthusiasm.
Yes, in fact, my son said that you went to his church over in Richmond to talk about the Alpha course.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you something? You've been in prison, and you will know that there's a great deal of cynicism about people who have suddenly got religion, especially when it's coming up to parole time and so.
Oh, absolutely.
Can I just ask, did you have any questions like that asked? And
Often, and still occasionally, bucketfuls of cynicism have been poured over me. And I used to get rather upset by it at first, because I thought, well, I'm doing something right, and I feel very committed to it, only to have some pretty scathing, cynical comments made in my direction quite frequently. And then I thought, well, why should I get worried about this? I'm not doing this in order to make brownie points. I'm not trying to launch a public relations initiative on my behalf. If I was doing very badly. I'm doing it for an audience of one. The God I'm come to believe in. He, of course, will know, since he knows all the secrets of our hearts, whether I'm a PR phony. He'll know whether I'm trying sincerely to reach out to him and be reached by him. And I'll stop worrying. And I did. And it has been a very, very good journey. But cynicism is all part of the package.
Okay. Now, there might be some people watching this today, listening to this today, who are in really very, very deep trouble. As deep as you were, perhaps not so well publicised, but as deep as you were. In 2 or 3 sentences, could you say what they should do?
There's a great English cliche, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Not bad advice. It's not nearly as good advice as when you're in a hole, start praying. And I would say, do something that I was told to do and made a big difference. Read a psalm, a very famous psalm called sometimes the Prisoner's Psalm, because Oscar Wilde wrote a book about it during his prison sentence, sometimes called the Out of the Depths Psalm. And it's Psalm 130, and it begins, out of the depths, O Lord, I cry to you, Lord, hear my voice. Lord, be attentive to my cry for mercy. And the word cry really, I think, can just as well be interchanged with prayer. Lord, listen to my prayer. And so once you start to ask God for help, on the whole, like he did with the prodigal son, he comes rushing out to see you. And that's what happened to me.
And since then, you feel that you've grown in faith. We have an idea in Methodist Church that one grows in holiness, and that's your aim. And do you feel that you still have more to learn?
Absolutely. I never stop learning. I'm quite a diligent keeper of quiet time every morning. And in lockdown, I find there's more space to have more time. But I am learning all the time. In my prayer life, in my Bible reading life, in my reading of great spiritual authors. I think following God is like university where you never take your degree. You're always studying, you're always growing. And so I, in some ways, know how little I know about the extraordinary riches of God's grace. And I'm amazed by how prayers get answered. I'm now, of course, minister to people like prisoners. And this is wonderful. I've never been happier or more fulfilled in my life doing what I'm doing now.
Right. Well, can I just move on slightly to something? And that is that your story is a classic, a redeemed sinner story, a classic testimony almost that is at times seen as being very individualistic. That, I've got the grace, so I've moved on. And yet more and more people are saying that our Christian faith should address the world around us. Now, I'll let you into a secret. When we met at the National Prayer Breakfast, I was taken aside by one of the organisers who misunderstood British politics and misunderstood the difference between the European Parliament and the House of Commons and so on. And he asked me would you take care of him for us, you see? And I think I made you a couple of phone calls. But I must admit that my attitude to you at that point was what one of your new friends, when you were at Belmarsh, said. Aitken is a lying, blood-sucking Tory parasite, not fit to clean a miner's boots. And I read that as I was preparing today, and I thought, yeah, I'd like to ask you about the mining disputes, because for a lot of Methodist communities, that was a calamity in so many ways. And I'd just like to ask you, and I'd really like to put you on the spot here, if as a politician you had been a Christian, if you'd had these experiences beforehand, do you think you would have acted differently about issues such as the miners' dispute?
Well, I guess I would have said things a bit differently. But I, as it happens, was a rather rare bird in the Tory party. I was a Conservative MP who had a lot of miners in their constituency, because I had the East Kent coal mines.
Mm-hmm.
They were small but very noisy and very, very strong in their views. And of course, I was the local Tory MP, public enemy number one, but not absolutely completely, because one rather unknown chapter in my life is that I once had a kind of a coal board scholarship and went down the mines for 2 weeks in the Barony Colliery at Ayrshire in Scotland. And the one thing I know from the, being underground with the guys, that miners are wonderful people. You may not agree with them politically, but I think it was Harold Macmillan said they're the best men in the world. And I've always really thought that since doing that scholarship. And I always got on actually with the coal miners of East Kent, even though they used to throw potatoes and eggs at my meetings. The problem with the miners' strike, and I suppose I'm being a bit political here, but it's what I believe, is that the miners' strike was a case of lions led by donkeys, or a donkey. I mean, Scargill, in my view, was the worst union leader of all time, who led his men over a cliff, refused to get a ballot, and so on. We don't want to relive all that, but saving the miners from bad leadership was obviously because they are so loyal to their leadership. Even so, they split, of course. But I wonder, you know, my sympathies might have gone deeper now, but I don't think I said Scargill's leading them in the right direction. Of course, he took on a tough one in Margaret Thatcher, but she couldn't possibly surrender to or agree with Scargill's demands. So it was then a war of attrition, which Scargill thought he would win, but was very misinformed about. Again, part of bad leadership.
Well, can I just push you a little bit further again? And
sure.
That is that one of the things that you say in your book, and you've said earlier in this interview, is about the cuts to prison funding and so on. And the last 10 years have been very difficult for a lot of public services, even public libraries and archives and so on, I'm finding. I find it very, very difficult to survive. Do you think that your Christian faith makes a difference about your attitudes to public service and what you might call the common purse and the commonwealth?
Yes, I think it would. I was once Chief Secretary of the Treasury, sometimes called the government's axeman. And but I'd like to think that Ken Clarke and I steered a fairly humane course when faced with the imperative, unfortunately, of sometimes trying to at least balance or make more even the books. I think Christian faith should make a difference to decisions on public expenditure. And I think the prisons are a very good example of that, in the sense that there are no votes in prisons. There are precious few political voices, and yet here's a very important part of our national life. I have developed over the years, I actually began it while I was a prisoner, a huge admiration for most prison officers who do an underpaid, very difficult job in extremely difficult circumstances. And we are making a mistake if we think we can cut the prison service still further, because the only thing to cut in the prison budget, 80% of which is made out of prison officers and prison staff wages. There aren't no cuts to be made unless we're going to go back to dangerous prisons all over again. So my Christian faith would certainly, if I was miraculously transformed back into Chief Secretary of the Treasury, a job I would not have liked to have after the coronavirus, cuts which will have to follow in expenditure and the increases in taxation which will have to follow as we work a way out of paying for what's going on now. I think I would be very much guided by Christian principles and Christian faith, and I wasn't guided by Christian principles or much of a Christian faith when I was in the cabinet.
Well, it's been really nice to talk to you again, Jonathan. I've certainly enjoyed making contact. I do remember the last time we met, we had a long conversation about cauliflower growing on the Isle of Thanet. And I subsequently went to an NFU meeting with the on the Isle of Thanet, and I talked about cauliflowers, and I thought I was wonderful. I didn't have the. I decided not to mention that you tipped me off.
You must have got thunderous applause.
But I did indeed. But I did find out that we do have one other family connection almost, and that is that you're the part-time chaplain at HMP Pentonville.
That's right.
And my father served there in 1961 briefly. So wow. I remember that well.
There really is a connection.
So,
and if I had met him, I wonder if we would have got on. And I bet we would have done, usually for an unusual reason. He might have been very cynical about this sort of rather posh-spoken chaplain lurking around a dog collar. And I still, to this day, quite often get the two-finger sign or shouts like F off pie and liquor equals vicar in prison language. And but I usually play a card, and I would certainly would have played it with your father, by saying, hey, hang on a minute, I've been a prisoner too. And they stop in their tracks and express disbelief. But within 30 seconds, as you start to talk the jargon of, oh, well, I know what it's like on Sea Wing and Elmley or Belmarsh, they realize that they're talking to the real McCoy. And so from there, a relationship builds and very often ends in a conversation. I always say to every prisoner I've talked to, may I say a prayer for you or for your family? It's surprising how rarely anyone says no, thank you.
Well, it's been really good to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for joining us online at City Road Methodist Church, Birmingham. If you'd like to know more about us, go to our website www.cityroad.org.uk or find us on Facebook and Twitter.